Welcome back. The Law Society of Namibia has entered the discussion on the establishment of a sex offenders registry. The society is urging government and stakeholders to look at finding alternative solutions, including the creation of a sexual offenders registry and further calling on the enforcement of stricter sentencing for those found guilty of committing gender-based violence, femicide or sexual violence. Joining me now this morning with more is Veziruapi Hindjou, a member of the Law Society of Namibia's Standing Committee on Child, Gender, Family Law and Human Rights. Good morning, ma'am, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Now, one of the major reasons of the sex offenders registration and notification laws is the idea that sex offenders are more likely to relapse than other types of offenders. Now, is this one of the grounds in which you are advocating for a registry?
At this moment, the advocating for the registry is at its infant stage. We are still in the process of trying to see what research is needed, what answers we need to answer, what angles we need to look at. But definitely, reoffending rates are definitely one of the contributing factors. It's nothing foreign. We read about it in the newspapers every day, especially gender-based violence. It's something that needs to be looked into, and we are hoping that this is a step towards, yeah.
Now, what do we know about the levels of reoffending amongst sexual offenders? Has a study been done yet? I know you mentioned that you're still conducting the study. How far is it?
We have not begun yet. Like I say, we are still in the process of engaging stakeholders, looking at answers that we need to, questions that we need to answer, just to make sure that we get our basis right, because it is rather a sensitive topic, and we want to make sure that once we start with it, we have our basis right. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that make it very sensitive is that one is considered innocent until proven guilty.
Indeed.
Would this registry only contain details of people who have been convicted?
That is the aim. That is one of the objectives that we wanted to look into. There are different types of registries around the world. However, we are looking at our neighboring country, South Africa, and there they rather use convicted offenders. So obviously also protecting somebody's freedom to be presumed innocent until found guilty. Obviously the only people that can be included on the register are those that have been convicted.
In some parts of the world, citizens have access to these records, so they might be aware of a convicted sex offender in their midst. In other parts, such a database is only accessible to law enforcement agency. What does the Law Society propose?
Like I've said, we are still very much still in the infant stage of the research process itself. However, we are inclined to want to make it more accessible to officials, law enforcement officials, and officials that are in need of this information on request. Opening this list to the public right now is not one of the considerations that we are looking into. However, we are open to that if that is what the research calls for. Once we are done with the research and we see that there could be benefits to this, it's definitely something that we could look into. But as of now, it is something that we are looking into strictly for law enforcement agents.
Now, could this sex offenders registry not result in harassment by the public and furthermore render rehabilitation difficult?
Indeed, one has to look at it more so as it's not a punishment for the offender. I think if we take away that element and we don't look at it from that perspective, then you will realize it's more so just to empower our law enforcement agencies to at least make sure that this information is accessible, should it be needed, especially in instances such as what we've recently been reading about in the newspapers with a teacher that was put in a position of trust with students, and he has a history of sexual offenses in his past. So that information would have been useful in such an instance. So yes, we are slightly infringing on the rights of the offender, but like I said, certain rights are they're not absolute. They can be limited where it's necessary. And I think in a situation where sexual offenses are involved and a community is at risk, I believe then we unfortunately have to encroach a little bit on the rights of the offender.
Now, it is not a secret that there is somewhat of a huge gap between the minority and the elite. So how do we ensure that the registry is not protective of the elite and represents everyone in its entirety?
The names that will be entered on the register are convicted sexual offenders. Unfortunately, we don't have much sway in the legal process. Despite what your connections are or who you are in society, ultimately justice applies equally to everybody. So once you're convicted, I don't know how your elitism will help you in such a situation.
Now, with the dismal conviction rate of sexual gender-based violence and the volume of pending cases, shouldn't we rather question the failures of the investigative machinery?
We are all one organ. Namibian police, we are all part of the legal justice process. There are a lot of elements that obviously need to be looked into. There's still room for improvement in a lot of areas in our justice system. That is not a secret. However, I believe that there are still convictions taking place. People are still being held accountable for their actions. Whether it takes time, ultimately we do get there. So I think if it's a collective effort. If we all work together somehow, I believe we'll get to a point where we can have some faith or higher faith in our justice system. Yeah.
An article on the UKSA's website titled Pros and Cons of Sex Offender Registration concludes by saying, history has shown that a collective response to a national problem concerning safety and security does not necessarily make it the right one. Today's sex offender registry laws are no longer rationally connected to their regulatory purpose. More driven to appease a fearful public, legislation has been transformed into excessive criminal penalties. It is time to provide meaningful guidance on the parameters that will support the state's interest and in keeping their communities safe while providing constitutional protection to offenders. What do you make of these sentiments?
I believe the writings in that particular paper are based off of countries where the sexual registry of list is now currently, it has been ongoing. It's a standing item. It's part of their justice system. We are still very much in the infant stage of everything. We have to look at it from a Namibian perspective. We want to see what are the values and views of our people and to see how we can best include those in a registry that is similar to the sexual offenders registry as is used in the States, in South Africa. So we still want to see how it applies to our people. But indeed, also, like I said, the rights of an offender, once convicted, will be encroached on slightly. We're not looking at this from a perspective of further punishing an offender. That is not the aim. Our legal justice system is there more so for reform. We do believe people do reform. And also we can look into instances where if you have not offended for a certain period of time, what could that mean for your name still be included on a sexual registries list? But again, this is all going to be part of the research that we want to look into prior to even proposing something like the sex registry list.
Any final remarks?
Like I said in the beginning, it is a rather sensitive matter. The view is finding a balance that will satisfy most of the parties involved. Unfortunately, you will never satisfy everybody. But our aim is to protect the vulnerable members of our society. Gender-based violence is a real problem in Namibia. And unfortunately, children as well are targets in such instances. Our aim is just to make sure that people that are put in positions of trust are not in a position to violate that trust. And at least the people around them, the communities around them are aware or in a position at least to protect themselves once you know who's in your midst. Unfortunately, it does encroach a little bit on the rights of an offender. But I believe it's an encroachment that is justified in the instance. Yeah.
All right. Ms. Hindjou, thank you so much for taking our time to talk to us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I was speaking to Veziruapi Hindjou, who is a member of the Standing Committee on Child, Gender, Family Law and Human Rights in the Law Society of Namibia.